April 11, 2019, 11:33 a.m. ET. Order reprints. Print article. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, Mark Wilson/Getty Images. Trade talks between the U.S. and China have produced another positive development, with Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin saying negotiators have reached an accord on a broad mechanism to enforce whatever trade pact is eventually reached. While the development could give markets something to cheer, some major question marks still remain over the details of any such enforcement, and what happens to tariffs. In an interview with CNBC on Wednesday, Mnuchin said both sides had agreed they would create enforcement offices to deal with ongoing matters. "We've pretty much agreed on an enforcement mechanism," Mnuchin said. "We've agreed that both sides will establish enforcement offices that will deal with the ongoing matters." But his remarks were light on the types of details that will further assuage concerns about trade, which have been a continued source of concern for the central bankers and finance ministers gathered in Washington, D.C., for the International Monetary Fund and World Bank spring meetings. Mnuchin, for example, didn't say if tariffs would be part of enforcement of what is decided in a pact. Investors this year have been pinning their hopes on an eventual resolution to the U.S.-China trade war, pushing markets higher even as a final deal has yet to materialize. The Dow Jones Industrial Average has gained about 12% this year through Wednesday's close, while the S&P 500 is up about 15%. Trade watchers have warned that some sort of mechanism for monitoring and enforcement is crucial for a good trade deal, but also one of the trickier parts of negotiations. Scott Miller, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and former head of trade policy for Procter & Gamble, says enforcement is U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer bread and butter, having spent 3 decades focused on steel industry and enforcement provisions. Miller told Barron's it is possible a trade deal would leave tariffs in the mix, perhaps with some conditional relaxation, if the Chinese stick to monitoring and enforcement. What happens to tariffs? More details about a structure for enforcement, and questions about market access are still unanswered for those keeping tabs on trade. Also noted by trade watchers, the comments came from Mnuchin, not from Lighthizer, who is the lead trade negotiator for the U.S. At a news conference on Thursday, Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, reiterated that a rebound in economic growth in 2020 is precarious and subject to downside risks, in part related to unresolved trade issues. The strong rally in stocks this year is partly from investors pricing in some man-made solutions, including on trade. That, of course, leaves open the possibility of disappointment.